The quiet heat on Central Avenue late at night carried a heavy silence that felt entirely new to the neighborhood, where vibrant banners once hung from storefront windows calling for political revolution and black empowerment. Only torn posters flapped against the red brick in the warm Santa Ana winds. The charismatic political figures who had once filled these halls with radical speeches were suddenly gone, removed by prison cells, exile, or sudden violence in the closing months of 1969. During the late 1960s, South Los Angeles was fundamentally shaped by disciplined political groups that gave structure, identity, and direction to local youth. The Black Panthers and the U.S. organization competed aggressively for the minds and allegiances of young people across neighborhoods like Watts and Compton. These organizations provided structured political education, free breakfast programs for children, and organized community defense, effectively channeling community outrage into ideological purpose rather than aimless personal conflict. By 1970, that entire institutional umbrella was systematically crushed by targeted federal surveillance, heavy police pressure, and violent internal factional warfare. Intelligence operations relentlessly exploited existing friction between rival organizations, culminating in fatal public clashes like the 1969 Campbell Hall shooting at UCLA. As key leaders were systematically imprisoned, driven into hiding, or killed, the overarching organizational hierarchy that had governed street dynamics disintegrated across South Los Angeles. The complete removal of these structured political organizations created an abrupt power vacuum across hundreds of urban residential blocks. Young men who had depended on those institutions for political identity, personal discipline, and mutual protection were suddenly left standing on street corners without leadership or clear objectives. The ideological vision was stripped away, yet the severe economic neglect, social isolation, and structural abandonment of South Central remained completely unchanged. With no overarching political movement left to unite them or focus their energy, community defense shifted rapidly to the most immediate physical reality available, which was the neighborhood block. Disorganized groups of teenagers began gathering around local parks, housing projects, and specific street intersections to form hyper-local protective cliques. Connecting security directly to local geography, the grand dream of global political liberation dissolved into an aggressive focus on defending immediate pavement, without national agendas or ideological doctrine to direct their energy outward against institutional neglect. Street dynamics turned violently inward. The recognized adversary was no longer systemic authority or economic inequality, but the group of youth living just 3 streets over on a parallel avenue. A new street currency emerged, measured not by political literacy or community organizing, but by immediate physical dominance and total territorial control. For a teenager navigating South Los Angeles in the early 1970s, simple daily survival required choosing an allegiance based purely on a home address. Walking to the local grocery store or high school meant navigating invisible borders, where making a single wrong turn onto an unfamiliar block could result in sudden, severe violence. The collective community solidarity of the previous decade vanished, replaced by continuous hypervigilance between neighboring streets. This sudden territorial shift was accelerated by the steep economic collapse of industrial Los Angeles during the exact same decade. Major manufacturing plants along the Alameda corridor shut their doors permanently, eliminating tens of thousands of stable union jobs that had sustained working-class families. The loss of industrial employment crippled local households, removing vital financial stability, just as newly formed street entities were taking firm root in the neighborhood. As these localized cliques multiplied,
They began forming regional alliances to protect their turf against larger rival coalitions. Independent groups based around local high schools like Fremont or public housing complexes like Imperial Courts established firm connections across the east side and west side.
What had started as isolated self-defense cliques quickly transformed into structured territorial networks claiming entire residential tracts across the city map. Law enforcement responses during this systemic transition focused almost entirely on heavy containment and aggressive suppression tactics. Dragnet sweeps and sudden neighborhood raids routinely swept up whole blocks of young men, unintentionally strengthening the internal bonds and solidarity of these territorial groups. Inside juvenile halls and state prisons, localized street ties were formalized, structured, and hardened into lifelong allegiances that carried back to the block. The human toll on local families across South Central was immediate, severe, and relentless. Parents who had spent the late 1960s organizing civil rights marches now found themselves pleading with their teenage sons to stay indoors after dark. The former hope of broad structural social progress was replaced by an ongoing cycle of personal tragedy, sudden loss, and lingering grief on quiet residential streets. By 1972, the shift from ideological political activism to strict territorial control was firmly established across the southern basin of the city. The primary language of the street shifted permanently, replacing political terms like self-determination and liberation with block numbers, street names, and territorial hand signs. Street authority was no longer derived from political charisma or organizational leadership, but from raw physical enforcement of geographical turf borders. This strict territorialization created a self-sustaining cycle of localized feuds that demanded endless retaliatory violence. A minor verbal insult or an unauthorized crossing of a major boulevard routinely escalated into violent conflicts that drew in entire residential blocks. Over time, the original spark of a feud was completely forgotten, replaced entirely by a perceived obligation to honor fallen friends through continuous territorial expansion. The impact of this power vacuum expanded well beyond the central core of South Los Angeles into surrounding industrial hubs like Compton and Watts. Similar structural dynamic shifts played out in Latino barrios across East Los Angeles, where historic neighborhood borders were drawn deeper by shifting demographics and economic pressure. Across every demographic line, physical geography had become the absolute dictator of street survival. Municipal planning and urban development decisions during the 1970s further deepened this physical fragmentation. The construction of massive physical freeways and industrial rezoning sliced older neighborhoods into isolated landlocked enclaves, severing traditional walking routes between adjacent communities. Structural isolation turned each cutoff district into a high-pressure environment where local territorial defense became the default mechanism for survival and identity. The overall psychological atmosphere of South Los Angeles altered dramatically as public spaces transformed into dangerous contested ground. Community parks that had once hosted political rallies, neighborhood breakfasts, and health clinics were now viewed as dangerous border zones where presence alone was interpreted as defiance. Local civic life rapidly withdrew behind locked doors and security grates as open avenues became battlegrounds for neighborhood dominance. As territorial boundaries stabilized across the city, control over local underground economic avenues became essential to maintaining group power. The total decline of formal employment made informal street commerce one of the few viable sources of income in neglected neighborhoods. Turf was no longer merely a matter of neighborhood pride. It had transformed into a critical economic asset that demanded constant defense against prospective rivals. By the middle of the 1970s, leadership models on the street had completely inverted from the structured hierarchies of the previous decade. Instead of older political leaders setting strategic goals, street authority fell into the hands of young, decentralized leaders operating purely at the local level. Influence was claimed by those most willing to enforce territorial boundaries, creating an environment where immediate aggression was consistently favored over diplomatic negotiation. The complete loss of older political statesmen left young street organizations without experienced mentors capable of resolving volatile, localized disputes. Without recognized authority figures to mediate conflicts, minor personal disagreements rapidly escalated into full-scale turf wars between neighboring residential streets. Conflict resolution became nearly impossible when backing down was interpreted as ceding valuable territory and exposing an entire block to vulnerability. When historians examine the decline of 1960s radical political movements in Los Angeles, they frequently focus on the destruction of national groups as a final chapter. However, on the ground, that collapse was not an ending, but the origin of an enduring structural shift. The elimination of political organizations did not destroy the fundamental drive for collective defense. It merely stripped away the ideology and left pure geography behind. City officials and law enforcement agencies failed to recognize that dismantling political organizations without fixing root economic neglect would yield a far more chaotic environment. By neutralizing centralized political entities that possessed clear leadership and articulable demands, authorities inadvertently created hundreds of independent, leaderless street entities. These scattered groups were far harder to monitor, anticipate, or address through standard institutional channels. The long-term consequence of this transformation reshaped daily life across multiple generations of Los Angeles residents. Children growing up in the late 1970s entered an urban landscape where territorial borders were accepted as permanent realities of existence. The memory of broad civil rights coalitions faded into local legend, replaced by the immediate, practical necessities of defending specific physical blocks against rival enclaves. By the end of the 1970s, the territorial map of South Los Angeles was thoroughly locked into place across the city. What had started at the turn of the decade as isolated defense cliques filling a political power vacuum had solidified into an entrenched social infrastructure with its own rigid customs and permanent physical boundaries. Territorial control had definitively replaced political ideology as the primary organizing structure of the street. The historical narrative of the 1970s power vacuum illustrates how systemic neglect and the suppression of legitimate political outlets can reshape the social foundation of a metropolitan area. When community defense is stripped of political purpose and constructive guidance, it defaults to the brutal mechanics of physical territorial dominance. The dynamics forged during this period created an enduring template for street politics that resonated far beyond Southern California. The story of 1970s Los Angeles reveals how power operates within isolated urban environments when formal support is systematically removed. Power on the street is never truly destroyed. It simply changes form, shifting from broad political organizing to hyper-local territorial enforcement. When the expansive political ambitions of the 1960s were dismantled, the collective effort for survival condensed directly onto the concrete of the local block. The historical legacy of that 1970s power vacuum remains visible beneath the surface of the city today. Understanding the modern street landscape requires looking past superficial explanations to examine the precise historical shift where political activism was crushed, leaving an empty stage that geography alone would fill. In the land of no pity, the territorial borders established in that crucial decade remain written into the foundation of the streets. Get Land of No Pity at lahoodpolitics.com.